My name is Tony. I am an ex-Deloitte consultant on strategy and operations, but turned entrepreneur 10.5 years ago now, which is when we set it up Cantox. And Cantox is a company we've helped to help businesses not be scared anymore of currencies, if I can put it in very simple terms. So what we aim to do is really to streamline the whole operations and help companies make companies truly international in the sense of not having currencies as a problem, being immune, and make their business as easy as if it was same currency. So I guess that ties quite well with the question of why am I here. But I would like to highlight something that Laurie has said already, which is the opportunity that the hospitality industry has with this topic. Normally, currency is a topic that is a problem that needs to be managed. And I think we are early enough in the hospitality industry that still for the first movers, it can become a competitive advantage. So I'm really looking forward to share my thoughts with the rest of the panelists and hopefully enlighten a bit the industry and make some people think about it.
Great. Well, thanks a lot. So I think we've introduced each other. On my side, I'm Pascal Berg, hence the French accent, based in Paris, and I'm a director at Edgarden & Company, a consulting firm in payments, and I run our travel payment practice. So what we'll do for this panel, we thought we'd structure it in 3 sections, about 10-15 minutes in each section. At first, where are we today? So what are hotels doing today when it comes to currency? What are some of the pain points and issues, so that we understand where we are? So we'll spend, as I said, 10-15 minutes here. And if you already have questions, feel free to add them in the chat box or the Q&A box. And if there's any burning question, we can take them straight away. After that, we'll talk about where do we want to go. So if we talk about a guest-centric multi-currency strategy, is that where we want to go? What does it mean? Are they? What are the benefits for doing that? And then at the end, the third section, we'll talk about how do we get there, right? Are there some hurdles to overcome? Why we've done it so far, and pitfalls to avoid, or best practices. So that's kind of the structure. So the panel will be about 40-45 minutes. We'll make sure to keep 5-10 minutes at the end for Q&A. And if you're a nice audience, we've got some interactive poll questions for you as well that we'll ask you, and you'll have a little bit of work to do. So let's start straight away with where are we today. And Tony, you spoke last, so maybe you can speak first on this one. If you had to describe what hotels are typically doing today, we hear things like bin-driven dynamic currency, hotels own currency. There's maybe some definition as well. So maybe can you clarify maybe some of the key terms and what are hotels typically doing today?
Sure. So I think the best would be to express this as a very typical maturity in terms of adoption of currencies in business. If we try to drive a timeline, the most frequent use to do is to reject currencies, to say, look, if we speak in the case of hotels, I have a property in this country and I have costs in this currency, so I'm going to be charging in this currency, so I'm able to generate netting, and I will take these revenues in this currency and net them against my cost in this currency. This is the most basic approach, and I would say why I was saying earlier, where I still find a large portion of hoteliers actually today. This is, my guess, is mainly driven because they've been very used to getting their product distributed by others. And it's normally others like DMCs, bed banks, or OTAs who have normally taken the burden of currencies. It is only now with the rise and increase of the direct selling, trying to set up a website and trying to direct to the customers, where they've realized that we as consumers like to pay for what we buy in the currency that we get our salaries in. And this is what has normally, I think we've all experienced this when we introduce our card, the first 4 numbers of the card, if I'm not wrong, Laurie will correct me if I'm not, it can tell in what country, 5, thank you, in what country was that card issued. And I think we can all relate when we see these screens that say, oh, we are super generous and we have found out that you are coming from a different country. Would you like me to charge in the country of your card? That's normally not the greatest deal for the customer. And I'm sure many people in the audience can relate and say, no, I want to pay in my currency. It's a first step to becoming more guest-centric, to coming closer, but it's still not delivering the best experience.
And do you think many hotels have done that already, or do you think really the majority are still in your first case of, they're just showing it in their own local currency, and that's typically where we are today?
I would say probably 40% at most. But clearly, and I will shut up, but I think the next step in the maturity, and what we'll talk a lot about today, is saying it's not acceptable to be presenting a price all the time to the customer in one currency, because we have made, many hotels, and this I would say is roughly 70% of hotels that say, look, this is costing you approximately this amount of euros, and it has this little ugly disclaimer in small letters and in red written below that all the people in marketing are telling us this is like draining conversion, and saying this is an approximate price, and then presenting a different one. This is not acceptable anymore, especially if you compare it to any e-commerce. And this is why if we compare it to any other e-commerce stores, we see the move to multi-currency pricing, presenting a price all the way from the beginning to the end, and this price being the one that our customer wants to pay into.
Okay, no, thanks for sharing that. Laurie and Anne-Marie, you've had experience in many other industries within travel, airlines, OTAs, and so on. Are the hotels really, that behind? Is it still your experience as well that many hotels still show only in local currency, where they're based, and haven't really embraced that topic? So this webinar here, we really still at the education stage and the awareness building stage, do you think?
Anne-Marie, do you want to take that, or?
Yeah, sure. So, they're great at in property. And if you look at typically the in property, you go to in property and you can have that option quite often to pay in your local currency. But it's clunky. It's not evolved. We that's been a standard and a default for so many years that actually it's not evolved in line with the sophistication of an e-commerce proposition and what you can do in terms of digitizing the whole experience and driving that from e-commerce upfront booking to in property. I really do think that there's few examples actually of a good experience of being able to book online, be presented with your local currency, and that then being driven, and that whole journey then being the same when you get into the property. And so that's when we talk about guest centric. I think that's really where we have got to do something that focuses with the guest first and what their needs are, because you're competing with an expectation that's been set by the industry, by these big retailers who are doing it, and to Tony's point, very, very successfully. And suddenly you go back 10 years, it's almost archaic when you then come to book and make a payment, through the booking systems.
Yeah. So go ahead, Laurie. Yeah.
Yeah, I would add to that I've been the co-chair of the GuestCentric working group at HEDNA for several years, as you know, and from the beginning, our intent and our belief has been that the currency of the property should not drive the experience, that we do need to flip this on its head and make sure that what is important is what is the guest need, what drives their ability to pay you. Obviously you want their money. I mean, let's just be honest, at the end of the day, this is about money. So how are you driving their choices to ensure that they are buying from you? And that is kind of the baseline of making sure that from the beginning, whatever experience they had to book your room at your hotel, all the way to your property can be a lot more consistent. And I honestly believe that COVID has given us a better position than we had before, because now you can unravel a lot of the things that prior to COVID, you probably didn't feel completely in a position to do. Like in terms of the number of bookings you're taking are probably lower now. So the impact of changes or doing things differently, you have a lot of choices because of this situation that you did not really have 18 months ago, especially the concept of doing things prior to landing on the doorstep of a property. That I think that attitude has completely changed.
Just before we go there, maybe a last question about where we are today. If I'm the devil's advocate, a lot of hotels, Tony thinks maybe 40% are still not optimized currency, right? They might just show it in the currency of the country where they're located. So if we have to convince these hotels, what's the pain point? What's the main issue that they're facing? Is it, do they risk customers not buying from them, or do they risk that customer not buying from their property directly and going to an OTA, and now you've lost maybe the relationship? Or what can we tell them is the biggest things they're missing out, or the pain point as a motivation to to change? Tony, I don't know if
Sure.
if you have to convince a hotel, why do we need to change? What's the case for change?
So I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but this is affecting different parts in the organization, and this is why this is a problem that cannot be solved only by the commercial team or by the finance team or by the accounting team. It's a more strategic problem. But if I go to what is it happening if you're not doing, we need to differentiate between displaying the price in the customer of the currency, and then the checkout part. In what currency are we really charging the customer, right? When I say 40%, I say 60% of the people are displaying the price of the hotel in the currency of the guest.
Okay.
But I wouldn't say more than 20 are checking out in the currency of the guest. Without a dynamic currency converter, the thing about the BIN card. What they are missing is mostly and foremost sales. People are not buying from them if they are not checking out, not to say if they are not displaying, in the currency of the hotel. If they have a resilient enough customer that went through all the cycle, the display of seeing a price in one currency and at the end being surprised with another currency, and they still want to put their card. Second is experience to that customer. Of course, you're going to frustrate that customer. But most importantly, what this customer is going to be charged for converting currency with his credit card is likely to be, I would say, at least 10 times more than what you as a hotelier can be charged to do this. Which means you're missing a revenue opportunity, which would still even decrease the price of the hotel and still make you more money. And the third thing is, especially on the case that Anne-Marie was talking about, where the guest is booking one day but only paying later, you are facing even a credit risk situation in which, imagine, let me put you in 2016, a UK guest going to Mallorca, booking in January and traveling in July. What happened is that the sterling depreciated more than 18%.
Wow.
Suddenly their holidays, because they were paying later, became 18% more expensive. This can drive cancellations.
Sure.
This can drive huge complaints. And this is why, if the hoteliers can have a way to address this and solve this problem for the client, there is a massive opportunity to capture value in the form mainly of increased revenues and more sales.
Okay. Well, personally, you've convinced me. So hopefully you convinced anybody who was on the call and needs convincing. So shall we maybe move to the second part of the discussion? So now we understand what's happening today and the pain point with the poorly ways done today when you look at currency. Where do we want to go? What's the ideal state? And I think the name for the webinar is GuestCentric multi-currency. And Laurie, you mentioned that's something that you try to push within Henna for years. So do you want maybe have a first pass at defining what is it? Because it sounds good, but exactly, can you elaborate on it, saying what is this vision? Where do we want to go?
Well, the vision is that the guest should drive the experience in terms of currency and when they're paying, right? And if you, to the degree that you can, promote the idea that they pay immediately and then just figure out why there would be any barrier to that. Maybe it was the refundability rule, maybe it was something else, but I think that's why I feel we're in a better position now to drive this forward, is because I think you can give up on some of those rules a bit easier now and make sure that if you centralize that process, then you can control the ecosystem around the payments. So when I say that, I mean not just the currency, but what are you doing about fraud? What are you doing about making sure you have a cash flow because you have the money and you're not waiting for somebody to show up who may never show up for whatever reason, right? what are you doing to then control that better? And GuestCentric allows you to do that. It allows you to put things up front, take care of the guest, and then as things evolve and change, you're in a position to work with that. You can have new policies or procedures driven, as we all know, overnight at this moment in time. when things about rules for travel have to go up and down, and you can't predict or control them. So I think, to me, that's where we've always been going. We've always been trying to say, look, collect the money up front, take care of the guest immediately, and do what you can then to ensure that when the property needs their money, work that out. Maybe you push it immediately. Maybe you hang on to it. It really does depend on the relationship between who's collecting the money and the property. But and to that point, we know there are lots of things that you need to look at.
Okay. No, that's I think that's a very clear definition. Anne-Marie or Tony, would you define this guest-centric multi-currency differently, or does that paint the picture where you think the hotel industry should be going?
Yeah, absolutely. So Laurie and I have talked, sometimes over this whole thing and this whole challenge about above payment, above property payments, and how we're going to actually derive the guest centrics and the way for guests to be able to take control of payments. And that's before you get to the property for your stay. Let's take a step back and look at the industry. What's happening with the technology providers. So the CRSs and the PMSs. What are the? Let's start with the CRSs in terms of the original booking, and that there's so much work going into trying to differentiate amongst their competitive solutions to say, actually, we really, really want to give the ability to customize, not just at the level of where we say, we want a sea view, but whether you want a balcony, whether you want to have 2 beds in the room or the 1 bed. And all of this work is because of the guest, because you want to give the guest the reason to come to you over one of your competitors and use your hotel. And then what a shame that all of this investment is done to then forget about payments, because actually then I'm a traveler and I've gone through this lovely booking process and I get to the point where I want to pay, and either my card type isn't available or a local payment type that I may want to, or if I'm in a LATAM market, I may want to pay an installment. So there's all these challenges, I think, that are faced, and they should be looked at entirely as part of the multi-currency strategy. So that's a component, certainly, but that's where we get, when we talk about guest, for me, is guest centric, is really about utilizing what we've got in the industry, what consumers are used to, and how we should really customize and allow them to drive how they want to pay. And then we can take that to property as well, so that you've got a much wider window of opportunity for that guest, rather than the booking being indirect, because actually they go indirect because, I think Tony mentioned it earlier, they go indirect because they can have a better offering in terms of payment offering. And so you don't get that guest or get any of exposure to that traveler until they hit your property. So your window of addressable of cross-sell, upsell, it's much more smaller than it would be if you were able to give them a motivation to come and book direct onto your .com.
Okay. And going back to Tony, yes.
No, I
was
wanted
just
to.
going back to you, actually. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No. Sorry. No, without disagreeing with anything that Anne-Marie and Laurie went say, I wanted to, if we focus on the topic of currency and take it to the extreme, while I completely am sold out on the value of the over property payments, I think that even if we're in the situation where is the property taking the payment, even on that situation, there is the guest centricity. I'm just talking about the currency factor, right? Yeah. The benefits I've mentioned earlier still apply. It can still be set up probably
so
with
you're still
the current.
Convinced that we should get extra sales, right? You should still have an impact on the sales.
Absolutely, and I'm sure the current. Normally the current payment provider of that property normally is ready to be supporting this. So I think most of the time, or from my experience, is a matter of will of the company really wanting to do it and aligning the different departments. Of course, if you go to an over property payment, this is going to be easier, it's going to be more scalable, and has many other benefits that Anne-Marie and Laurie were talking about. And I wanted to add just one second benefit that I forgot to mention earlier, which is when people are using websites to compare, to look at the different providers, just when like you're looking for flights. When I look for a flight in one of these comparisons and I want to go a hotel here, let's not say names, but you will simply not appear if you are selling in the currency of the hotel. I am just going to see the OTA because they are going to be selling in my currency. Mm-hmm. But if the property, or even if I have the overpayments, but I am not commercializing that hotel room in the currency in which is my home currency, even if it's the most competitive price, it will not appear. Mm-hmm. So this is one of the perfect examples that I was mentioning earlier, and that Anne-Marie was saying, you lose target audience.
Okay, so maybe just on that topic, let's maybe stop here just for 1 minute and ask the first question to the audience, because we mentioned about the importance that currency can have on impacting the revenues, the sales. I'd like to flip the question to the audience. So if you can maybe show the first poll question. So we assume that people in the audience are mostly working for hotels and that have some kind of involvement in the payment strategy. So is it could Hedna show the first question? Is it possible to show question A? If it's not possible, that's okay. But I don't know if the person in charge of the question can hear us or can show it. If not, don't worry. Well, I was because the question was to ask the audience about, are they focused on payment initiatives that help mostly on the revenue side, or the hotels more focused on anything that can help reduce the cost of accepting payments, or that can optimize the cash flow. Our assumption is most of you on the call, because we're in a recovery period, are focused on increasing revenues, and anything we can do that impacts sales, we assume as a highest priority. But that's what we wanted to validate with you with this question. So just imagine in your mind that you answered the question, and maybe we'll try to do the poll later on if we can.
Alternatively, I think we have a question on the chat if you want to substitute it.
Okay, yes. So I think John asked a question. Does accepting in local currency present any other legal responsibilities embedded in the currency's country you are accepting? So does anybody have an answer? Tony, is that for you, or anybody has a?
I do. I'm sure Laurie and Marie and Nod did as well. But in the end, your tax obligations, your regulatory obligations are depending on where the transaction is taking place. Is not determined by the currency. So the answer is no. There is no difference. What is different is if you are making the transaction in Thailand or you're making it in Luxembourg. This changes things. But if you're making it in Luxembourg in sterling or euros, there is absolutely no change and no difference.
And maybe we can have a whole different webinar about how to allocate a country when you sell online, right? That's a whole different discussion.
Yeah, but, point of sale. That's a whole day's workshop.
A whole day? Well, I thought an hour webinar would be not bad already on that. But if you want to do a whole day, is that an incentive to go to Miami in October? Is that what you're saying, Laurie?
There you go. That would be a good workshop.
Okay. So going back to our topic, so we believe, or I guess what the panel is trying to say is that a guest-centric strategy makes sense to give the guests choice of currency, of when they want to be paid. We talked about the how much is driven before property or at property level. If we project ourselves in the next 2 or 3 years, what's your sense? Is this guest-centric multi-currency approach going to become a standard or the default? Or for a while, if I'm a hotel and I do that, could it be a source of differentiation? Might be the first one, or might be doing it better, and therefore customers are more likely to buy from me, or maybe more likely to buy from me directly as opposed to going via an OTA, for instance. What's your view on that?
Well, I think it absolutely is a point of differentiation, because again, if you can appeal to the guest, not only in a currency or language for how they are shopping, then in the end, you can also ensure that the payment choices you're providing are centered on them, right? So if you've got a Chinese guest that's buying from you, you would like to make sure at the end you're offering them choices about how they're paying that are inclusive of Chinese payment methods like Alipay, WeChat Pay, obviously Union Pay from a card perspective. So it absolutely makes a difference, because you want to get them through the journey to the checkout page and then not lose them because you didn't offer them some of those what the cards would call alternative payments, or
So therefore,
GuestCentric
should we have called a webinar more a guest-centric, local payment experience? I mean, of course, currency is a big part of it, right? But what you're saying is also the local forms of payment, right? So that are relevant for the customer.
They're very relevant, because if you get the currency right, then you can offer those payments at the end. But if you never offered the Chinese currency, you can't offer them a Chinese wallet to pay with.
Right.
So.
And Anne-Marie and Tony, in your discussion, I assume you spend also a lot of time talking to hoteliers. Is that typically when you have the conversation, do the two go together? They ask about, which local payment methods for that country, and then talk about the currency at the same time, or what are the kind of conversations when people try to think about the future experience they want to deliver to their consumers?
No, I think there's been a challenge, and there still exists to be a challenge, that actually when they start to think about the multi-currency and how to handle that, it becomes a wider treasury conversation. And of course, I think that opens up some concerns and this perceived view that it becomes a lot more complicated than, to Tony's point and Laurie's, that actually it's something that can be addressed and can be solved. And it's happening, outside of hotels in the standard e-commerce offerings. It really depends on how, and dare I say it, but how sophisticated the hotelier is in terms of their knowledge of what the expectation of their consumer is, and understanding the demographic of the travelers and what is typically as a default a standard offering. And to Laurie's point, if you have a Chinese traveler, you should absolutely be offering those alternative payment methods alongside the large card payment types, because that's just the norm for the market. And so I think, to become a differentiator, it's understanding your portfolio, understanding your guests, where they're coming from, and mapping out, and maybe it's that it doesn't make sense to serve every market and every guest,
sure.
But certainly know and do the cost analysis to work out, and that's where you should be working with various payment partners and all of the different partners in the industry to collaborate to utilize the knowledge and make sure you come up with a strategy for multi-currency. But that's just one part of it. Of course, it encompasses all these other alternative payment methods. And COVID-19 has been great in, dare I say it, in changing the way people want to pay. And you get into property, you don't want the touch, you want the touchless experience. You don't want to have that interaction or limited interaction. And so there's a window of opportunity here to really address what's already been talked about for a long time, but perhaps the movement hasn't happened. And I think that now is the time to say, let's take a break and let's realign and move direction and make this happen.
Definitely. No, that makes sense. And you just to get a question in my mind, you mentioned, the importance of knowing your demographics, who are your customers. And Tony, I don't know if you have a view on that, but you make the point about the importance of guest-centric, the impact on sales. Is that more the case for consumer guests, or for small business guests, or for corporate traveler guests? Might there be a different by segment, or is it, all kind of guests will expect this multi-currency as the ideal customer experience?
So if you allow me, I'll first make a comment about the guest centricity, try to take it to an extreme as a metaphor, and then go straight into the question on the type of guest and demographics. But for me, this is, as I said before, when you had your hotel full because the OTA was filling this hotel, you maybe didn't even have a website of the hotel. Or if you had a website, you had it in the language where the hotel was based, and that was it. And then if you were very modern, you went and translated into English. Now, when you realize that half of the hotel is full with, pick your favorite nationality, you have suddenly discovered that it's a good idea to have your website translated. Well, offering the price is just a part of the translation. I want to take it to this extreme, right? It's as basic as this. And the fact, and this goes to my comment at the beginning, I think today is a competitive advantage. I know tomorrow is going to be a must. The same way some years ago probably was a competitive advantage to have the website of the hotel translated. And maybe you discovered that you were making more margin because suddenly the website was in the direct language and the same language, and you were getting sales through there. So for me, it's taking it to this really basic comparison. About your type of guests, well, there are guests that knows more languages and guests that knows less, no? But I would make the differentiation on the B2B channel and the B2C channel. On the B2C channel, it is really important, right? As we are saying, the corporate trader, maybe the company, I mean, if they're booking for themselves, or maybe they care about less than the guest that is bringing the whole family for 2 weeks in the hotel. Man, that might be. I mean, of course, the bigger the basket, the more impact all of this has.
Sure.
But especially on B2B, I wanted to make a reflection. I think maybe still not today, it's a bit early, again, a competitive advantage, but tomorrow, especially those little agencies, you're selling to an agency in countries where there is a lot of volatility. You're selling in Brazil, you're selling in Turkey, you're selling in Russia, and not necessarily Russia, you're selling in the UK, as I was putting my example earlier. If you are forcing them to take over the problem, you are passing them the cost of conversion and the cost of managing the risk that is going to be linked of them selling in one currency and having to pay you in another. They will need to inflate the price at which they are selling your room. So you are putting a problem forward to your client, and this will damage your competitiveness.
Yep.
If you internalize that problem, if you solve that problem for them, once again, you're able to capture value. So the logic is quite similar. Of course, when you're distributing through very large corporations, they're supposed to make this right, and it's less of a problem. But
okay, no, that makes a lot of sense. So thanks for sharing your views on that. I'm just conscious of time, so we'll try to maybe have the last 10 minutes before we open up to Q&A about how do we get there. So if hopefully we convinced not just ourselves but people on this webinar that going towards a guest-centric multi-currency strategy makes sense. How do we go there? So if you haven't been there, if you haven't made it yet, there must be some hurdles, right? So are these technical hurdles we need to overcome? What's the issue? What I don't know if Laurie, you've tried for many years, right? So when you speak to the hotels, is it again we need to do more of this type of webinars and raise the awareness, or is it because they lack technical knowledge or resources? Is it because they haven't met people like Tony or Anne-Marie or whoever can help? Or what's the hurdle? What's the issue?
Well, I think, the hotel, the ecosystem that surrounds hospitality is very fragmented. Just need to acknowledge that and be realistic about it. But the point is, I think we've overcome a lot of those challenges. We've published a couple of different technical frameworks through our collaboration with HTNG. And we established our Open Payments Alliance, which helped provide that API and those two publications. So I think we've overcome some of what in the beginning was not even thought of as a strategy, and now of course it is. And I think now we need to take advantage of the position that we're in with the post-COVID recovery to enable doing things prior to arrival at the property. And to Anne-Marie's point, touchless is the name of the game. And if you can establish as many opportunities prior to arrival, prior to check-in, to help that guest do whatever they need to do, upsell, collect their money in advance, and then do all the work around optimizing the cost of that acceptance, and also at the same time increasing your ability to Tony's point, to actually drive more revenue. Those are the 2 points I think we finally have a moment where people at the properties, the companies managing the properties, the chains, the brands, I think we're all ready to figure that out. And that's why I'm very excited about this moment in time, even though it has been dreary for 18 months. I think we're really at a point where we have a great opportunity to sort this out, just to break it down and sort it out.
So it sounds like it's the right time, but Anne-Marie or Tony, can you think of any other hurdles you have to overcome, or other pitfalls we need to avoid here?
You want to go, Anne-Marie?
I'll just talk a little bit more of my experience coming from my previous role, so working in payments on the acquiring side of things. So I think there's always been the challenge of appetite to play as an international player who can provide the scale of the multi-currency solutions and what's required there, alongside, of course, working with other partners like Tony brings to the table. But I think the challenge is that it's still this concept of individual property and payments at property, and Laurie's absolutely right that there's been a lot of support in the industry to help everybody get their head round and understand technically how are we going to be able to enable payments to be taken at the forefront. And and there's more CRSs. I know from the Amadeus side of things, it's very much, I mean, I've been brought in solely as a focus on in the hospitality strategy to enable this, and that's the key thing here. So we've got to have the technology players to allow this change to happen and the enablement there, and I think the foundations are in place, but we still do need the brand.coms of the world to be able to support the scale and to be able to help with the economies of scale in terms of the negotiations and all of the value that they can bring to the table to really help individual properties more at a level to be able to implement something like this. So I'm really hoping that we can still see a shift in the ownership of that transaction and see the industry take on board, you know, an above property payment strategy. And it may well be that ownership of the transaction still remains with the individual property, but is very much supported with the brands. And that for me is a big hurdle that I think if we could get over that, still the value of all the other things are going to just naturally come and hold. So I'm sure Tony can add from a different view.
Yes. Tony, what do you think?
Maybe I try to give a pragmatic view of what we see on the big data today. If I have to say one hurdle is going to be, I'm not going to blame it on the tech or in anything, it's really internal and it's ownership of this project. Internal to the hoteliers, I mean. This project, I mean, touches several parts of the business. One is the commercial side, the other is the treasury, and it also have to have impacts on the accounting. Needless to say, it touches as well the IT infrastructure, right? But as we see, there are different pieces together, and not necessarily wants to lead with the other. When and we see this problem in conferences, if I'm allowed to say this, but in conferences like Hendon, where from the hotels, maybe the distribution person is coming, or maybe just the finance person is coming, where this is a combined project. This is more transversal. So it either needs to be led by top management, or one of the pieces of the organization needs to have sufficient internal power to say, I'm going to bring my finance person with me, and we're going to map out how are we doing things today, how is it that we need to do them, and then, as tech people like to say, everything is possible. Then it's going to come, what is the investment? But as Anne-Marie and Laurie were saying, every day there is less work that needs to be done because systems are better prepared by default. But for me, the biggest resistance is that the understanding, getting the people around, I was going to say the table, maybe Zoom call, but really streamlining how this process needs to look like. So we say, okay, the commercial team is going to be using this FX rate to create a price in different currencies. And this price, we're only going to change it if the market moves this much or this less. Or we're going to be applying this markup or not. And this, the finance team needs to be aware. And then when the risk starts, because we have made a sale until we receive the money, the risk of the transaction is going to be managed this way. And then the project is put together. This is the project that we're being followed. This gets approved and then it gets implemented. But for me, the biggest hurdle, no doubt, is the understanding, internal understanding of how this process needs to work. Once that is done, executing is not the difficult bit.
Okay, I think that's a very good point. And maybe going back to Laurie, I guess we've seen that in many payment projects, it's always, well, it's not always, but it's often the same issue of ownership of project, right? Because payment often touches different parts of the business. So if you only have the finance person, you have only half or a third of the puzzle, right? And vice versa, if you only have the distribution person or the salesperson, you only have another third or quarter of the puzzle. So that's maybe also where this kind of webinars, working group, and we're heading now hopefully can help as well, right? By making it very clear that you need this cross-functional focus, right, on these kind of topics.
Yeah, I think it's across the travel industry, whether it was hospitality or airlines or any of these groups, I've always looked at it as, to Tony's point, it's a three-legged stool. And if any one of those pieces are not participating or not being supportive, then the rest will suffer or fail, because finance, treasury, whichever group that is, along with IT and along with your sales team, whether that's distribution or marketing, the revenue side of your company, those three need to be on the same page to make that drive, that strategy that you need to drive forward. They all need to be working together. And I think that for me at an airline, you could generally get your arms around that because you could find those people in the building when we, had buildings and things. But in today's, in the hospitality industry, it gets a little bit more difficult when who's running the show, who owns those choices to drive those revenues and to account for those revenues and to deliver those changes to drive that strategy forward. Those are the three pieces you need to identify. If you want a best practice, figure out who those stakeholders are, put your arms around them, get them in a Zoom call, pick your conference of choice, but figure them out and figure out the strategy behind how you're going to balance, because it is a balance between driving revenue and optimizing your cost of acceptance. That's a balance. Neither one can take the front seat. Remember, there's a pilot and a co-pilot.
And I think we've given a very clear takeaway to people in this call, right? So clearly, if you want to embark on moving towards a guest-centric multi-currency proposition, if you don't have this three-legged stool in place, it's not really worth going ahead, right? Or you need to have the three legs come together.
Like a cockpit of a plane. There's a pilot, co-pilot, and a navigator. The three of you need to be on the same page.
But that was a long time ago, right? They're not three people in the cockpit anymore. No, that was
it depends on the size of the plane. I do like the bigger ones.
Okay, I thought it was down to two, but anyway, so we'll find the right metaphor anyway when
figure it out.
Yeah, definitely. So no, that's a really good point. What about in terms of how to go about it? Sometimes I speak to hotels that make it sound like it's a huge project. Really, is it? Can you start incrementally? Can you do a pilot or start step by step, or is it really quite a big change? And Marie and Tony, I don't know if you have experience of doing that with hotels in terms of how big and how difficult is it, even if I have the right people around the table and I find the right technical partner and so on.
I can go. Sorry.
No, you go.
Yeah, so we have done many of these projects with hotel chains, and my experience is that here this is not an A/B testing in the sense that it's as complex to set it for one currency than for all the currencies and for all the hotels.
Yep.
So there is no reduced complexity, but we need to think that what we are doing is giving one more choice. We are not changing. We are not saying, oh, it was always like this, now it's going to be like that. I'm saying you can still choose the option that you've always had, and now you have a new one, right? So by default, it's a pilot, and by default you're going to see how well is it tractioning. So it's adding one more option in that sense. So for the complexity of the project, again, the most complex piece is, as we were just saying, is putting the right people around the table and then figuring out what is the exchange rate I need to use to calculate my prices. I need to tell my acquirer is going to acquire this amount in this currency, and then I need to streamline the treasury operation so the funds are converted normally at the same rate that I use to price. It's not a complex project, but again, people need to be understanding. And when you bring up the topic of currency, especially to a less skilled finance person, they are immediately scared and say, look, this is something that they need to approve. And of course, for treasury, this is like, look, you're giving me more work. Why do I have to handle more currencies? Go about it like you've always done. And they need to talk to understand what are the needs from each other. And then you build those business cases and you say, what are my demographics? What is my potential footprint in terms of currency? What is the markup I might be adding? What is my potential increase of sales? Okay, this is the net return of the project, and then you put it in the list of return weighted versus the time.
Okay, very good. And Marie, that's your view as well, that it's an add-on kind of project and it's feasible. It's not like a revamping or reinventing the world.
Yeah, that's it exactly. And I spoke of it earlier, that a lot of it's about perception, isn't it? And what is perceived as a larger project than it actually is in reality. But if you get the right people around the table, then it's absolutely doable. I think that the big thing for me is, when we're looking at a guest-centric view, is get the data from your guests, understand the guests and who is it that's coming into your and making these bookings and coming into your property to stay. And the numbers should speak for themselves. When you do that analysis, I know we've had more domestic travel and a bit of a switch now because of COVID, but the reality is that it will open up again. We are going to see more international bookings again, and back to the what we would normally expect. You need to be prepared for that and to take the opportunity now, and the numbers will speak for themselves to give you the business case. And then to Tony's point, to Laurie's, it's the collaborative and all parties working together. But I think start with your guest, really look into how they want to pay. And actually, if you're already taking payments online, your acquirer should be able to help you do the analysis to say, well, actually, your missed opportunity were all of these, but how many of those that actually were comfortable paying in a currency that they quite clearly didn't want to pay in, how many of those did abandon, did leave the website? And have they done that? Do the hotels do that level of analysis as well? The marketing teams, distribution, and all of these numbers should come together. I mean, data, we say it big data, but we rarely use the data and the insights to actually make changes. And I think that's the foundation for starting the conversations and get some serious contenders around the table.
Okay, very good. I like that. That's a clear action for people to take, and couldn't agree more that even some of the basic data is not used yet. So I'm conscious of time. We have about 5 minutes left to get questions from the audience. I can see that we have another question this time via the Q&A. So I don't know if anybody has a view on that. Does this time-sensitive risk distribution pose a problem of rate parity? So is that a question about trying to fix the FX rate at time of booking? Is that how you understand it, or Tony or Laurie or Maria? I don't know. Can you see the question?
Yeah, I can see that. The way I interpret this is actually, for example, a challenge that is happening in the aviation industry, that because rates are fixed during the whole day with an average of 2 days ago, actually, if you're a bit freak like me, you will discover that depending on the currency that you pay, in this case for the flight, but it can happen for hotels, is cheaper than on others, and sometimes significantly. So this is why I was mentioning earlier that this process on what FX rate to use and have to update these FX rates in order to create prices in different currencies is so critical. To exactly avoid this, you say, look, I never want my price in any other currency to be farther away that you define it, 0.5%, 1%, that depends on you. Right, but you can remove the problem of the rate parity. But of course, if you don't do this right, if you just say, look, it's just me, the commercial team, that I'm going to sell multi-currency and finance will figure its way, this is the type of problems that you get into.
Okay, so that was good question to ask, John. Thanks for asking it, and hopefully a good answer to that question. We maybe have time for 1 or 2 final questions. So I don't know if anybody wants to add the question either anywhere you want, either in the chat box or the Q&A. I'll give you a few more seconds. If not, we can go to conclusions and final words of wisdom. So let's see if there's no other question. Yeah, I'll maybe a key takeaway. I mean, what I've heard is you guys, hotels, need to look at it. It impacts sales and revenues and be behind compared to other sectors. So we need to go towards guest-centric. It's not that complicated, but you need to have the right people around the room and have the clear ownership. Anybody wants to highlight any other key takeaway or word of wisdom? So maybe we'll go again in the alphabetical order. So there's really no jealous. So Anne-Marie, do you have any final words of wisdom or key takeaways you want people to take from what you want to share today?
Yeah, sure. I think the key takeaway is we've got an opportunity, a window of opportunity from what's happened and some of the changes with COVID that it's brought. To me, the key takeaway is about the property. The emphasis of in-property payments is really less important now, in the sense that COVID has driven people wanting to not interact and want to be hands off as much as possible. So there's a good time to shift that, and the mindset is already shifted there to generate that as an e-commerce piece. And for me, the biggest takeaway would be to try to think about your guest as a and create a digital concierge. So they are almost having the concierge experience from the moment they make that booking, and that can be upfront on the website, and that gives you the ability to really home into them and customize and sell additional services to them to actually make them remember you and build loyalty. So it's not just building it through the loyalty the loyalty brands, but actually they come back again because they had such a great experience. So that's my kind of take on it.
Very good. Laurie, over to you for your key takeaway before we let you go back to your storm.
Yeah, stop blowing for a minute. So I think to all these points, for me, the most important thing is figure out a strategy, find the right people to help you do that, and make sure that you focus on not only the things that are helping you drive and keep and manage your cash flow. I would hope by now that's been very apparent that that's a really important aspect of whatever you're doing with payments, and then balance the cost of acceptance with how you are driving those revenues on these different channels. What payment choices are you offering to ensure that you can increase and drive more revenue from those choices? I think if you can figure that out right now, when, again, to Anne-Marie's point, it's probably a lot of local travel, so you're not dealing with a lot of currencies, but you will eventually. It will come back. It will scale. It all scales. The challenge is not I don't think in the technology any longer as much as it is in the decision making and the managing of the delivery of those decisions. And last but not least, figure out in advance how to measure what you're doing. Good. It will help you internally prove that what you're doing around payments and strategy is working the way it's supposed to. But as we said before, the data sometimes is very hard to find or not being utilized. So figure that out ahead of time. That would
Thank you, Laurie. And Tony, challenge for you to add anything else after Anne-Marie and Laurie. So
I'm going to buy that hook that Laurie left to complete it, and I'm just going to say, build the business case. The rest will follow. It's going to become so obvious once you've built the business case, the opportunity you have in front of you, that then when you realize about the potential, you will want to lead that project. You're going to by now know that you need to bring the right people into the table. That is not a long project, and the return is immediate and for the moment really big. If you are the last one, it is to not lose. But right now you have an opportunity in front of you that is to make more. And if you build a business case, as I say, the rest will follow.
Great. Well, thanks for that. My key takeaway is, clearly we can all learn from each other from this call. So hopefully we can have additional webinars, whether it's on this topic or on other payment topics. Hopefully many of you can go to the HEDNA conference in Miami in October. Thanks again to the sponsor Adyen, and especially thanks to Anne-Marie, Laurie, and Tony for participating in this webinar. And we'll see you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pascal.
Thanks to you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good.